Hi, everybody, and welcome to this panel discussion titled "Sharing is Caring?" Digital Dilemmas for the Cultural Sector. And as the title suggests, we are going to discuss the ways in which the cultural and especially the art sector relate to digital culture and digital practices. My name is Nikita Mathias, working at MUNCH as a concept developer, and here with me to discuss today's issue is an amazing panel. First off, I would like to welcome Maryam Jafri, who is a visual artist working across a whole range of media and genres, such as video, sculpture, photography, and performance. And she also currently works as a professor at the Oslo National Academy of the Arts. Maryam, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Leah Dickerman, who is Director of Editorial and Content Strategy at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, much better known under its abbreviated version, MoMA. Welcome, Leah, as well.
Thank you.
And our third speaker is Hrag Vartanian, who is Editor-in-Chief and co-founder of the excellent online art magazine Hyperallergic, who works as well as a critic and a curator. And like Leah, he is joining us from New York City, where it's still fairly early in the morning. Good morning to you as well, Hrag.
Morning.
So let's dive right into the discussion. So Leah, of course, the big issue that has been on our minds for the last at least 7 or 8 months or so has been the global COVID-19 pandemic, which of course has affected also massively museum institutions. How would you say MoMA has lived up to this challenge, especially related to your digital productions?
Well, as you can imagine, it's been a moment of great intensity for us since the museum closed in March, as I'm sure for many of you who are listening, it's really felt like several lifetimes. And I think that there's been at least a number of turns since March, and the very first moment, right after closure, was a sense of intense coming together, really wanting to make sure that the museum would maintain its mission and public face as a place for conversations and experiences for art. You know, we didn't want to go dark. And there was a really quick sense of pivoting to how could we create an event, something that would bring people together in a sense of conversation, not to try to recreate the exhibitions that we had in the galleries virtually. And we started our virtual view program, which we have one topic that's introduced by a short video and then features on magazine and a live Q&A. And we've done that on a series of topics. And that was really our first drive and first effort. And we really tried also to create resources so that instead of necessarily curating the galleries, we were curating the world a little bit more and giving suggestions of things that people might do or see or read or even make. But with June, of course, and I'm sure that you've had this experience too, with the huge racial justice movement, I think that our platforms were called upon to do other things. And we really focused on stepping back a bit as the museum and using our platforms as a place to elevate voices and works that were resonant in the moment. And we thought about programming that we could offer. We screened Arthur Jafa's film, A Kingdom Comes As, and Right On, which was a film from the 70s, a Black Power movie with the Lost Poets and Tourmaline Salacia, and we had conversations with artist Faith Ringgold, but really trying to make sure that our platforms could be a way to share perspectives. And now, I think as time has gone on, we've really felt some of the fiscal pressures too. You know, how do we sustain audiences? How do we keep our community of learners together, even sponsors together? And how can we work in that way? And that's been a whole new set of challenges.
And do you think those kind of like pressured innovations you had to react with, are these, would you say that these are like long-term solutions, or is it something that's going to disappear when the whole COVID create.
No, I don't think that we're going to go back to the way that we were. I think that there have been things that we've learned and seen, the way that digital programs can attract a really robust audience, the way that it can actually help address equity issues too. There's something extraordinary about digital platforms and helping you model the world that you want, and model behavior that you want as well. And I think it can help us be a platform to share artists' voices and perspectives with our audience in a very direct way. So I think that these are changes that we've taken to heart, and we'll see, I think, a much more prominent digital presence going forward. But I think we have a long, long way to go before we're in more stable fiscal terrain.
And this ability to react to current social issues that you're talking about and to give voices to others is something that you are very much working with at Hyperallergic, Hrag, I think. So could you say a bit more about this? Because Hyperallergic, it seems to me, really are at the forefront of a new type of art journalism. So where do you see the essential difference between what you do and more traditional art criticism based in print?
Yeah, well, I think definitely this conversation has been something we started a while ago. We're entering our 11th year actually next week. So, it's been quite a while now. I think the bigger issue for us is the fact that people's attention and the conversations are actually happening on these different platforms, right? It's not that we had this idea we were going to necessarily bring people to a platform. The reality was those conversations were already going on. And we were just engaging with them and helping amplify, discuss, understanding new kinds of conversations that are happening because of the way our world works, the way information is distributed, all these types of things, as well as, understanding that conversations are just multifaceted, and the idea of being centralized in one place is just not something that happens anymore. So for us, it's even hard sometimes to calculate how many people read us or engage with us because we have so many different platforms that have different audiences. So our podcast has a certain type of audience, and we've been breaking news and other things on that platform as well. But it's, for some reason, the ecosystem is still learning to understand how to deal with all these different parts of the conversation. So, our Instagram feed has a whole different conversation going on. So this is something from the get-go we've been very engaged with, and we've been sort of super engaged with social media from day one, because we see it as an integral part of the conversation. My background is in art history. That's where I kind of came to this field initially from. But at the same time, I also am very hesitant to the way art historical conversations can be very limited. And don't involve a lot of listening sometimes. And we're just really interested in the listening part of the conversation too. And that's something that I think is really undermining some traditional senses of authority in our field. It's this idea that we are listening to people and they can have just as legitimate and interesting, points to make. And I think this is a little bit of what we're seeing right now, particularly in the Black Lives Matter movement, the understanding that communities have things to say and institutions have to listen to them, and understand them and process them. And that's where we're really breaking down. One thing the pandemic that I think I've seen has been really positive is that for years, there was so much hesitation to go online to a certain way, where the majority of institutions wanted to go online. They wanted to have more robust programming, all these things. But it was really a small group of people that were holding that back. And whether it's, I don't want to assume, but I'm going to assume that partly they're probably a little older, a little more traditional in their training and these types of things. But the pandemic actually sort of exploded that. And now that is not even, you can't argue that anymore. And I think that's been a huge shift in the last little while. The one part I will say that I'm a little troubled by was all these institutions that were able to go online and put material online so quickly when the pandemic, many of us were wondering, what were you waiting for? So the idea that they were only going to go online when they're forced to in the last possible way was a little upsetting for many of us who've been wanting these online resources for a very long time. including access to events and different publications and photos and all these things. So, I think right now we're understanding that, this is a real opportunity to really push forward that bigger conversation we've been having for a very long time. And I think, no one can argue with it now because we simply cannot meet, in person, but we're seeing the fact that people are taking these online events much more seriously, the material much more seriously. Their literacy, online literacy has increased, frankly, which I think is something we should not discount. In the last 5 or 6 years, the art community's online literacy to digital has definitely changed. And these are all factors that we've always been pushing for, but we see like in the last year, it's been like a huge forward, which I think is
cool. And this diversity of voices that you welcome on your platform, I guess that also includes artistic voices. So let's bring in actually an artistic voice into the discussion. Maryam,
yes.
Since we invited you to this panel, I guess it's safe to say that you don't primarily paint in oil. So could you tell us a bit more about your artistic practice and how that relates to digital?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that you ask digital rather than internet. Mm-hmm. And it kind of reminded me when I started as an artist or started thinking that I could be an artist in the mid to late 90s, the digital was very bound up with or counterposed to the analog media. And that was really the discussion. This was the early days of, kind of indie filmmaking, and everybody from Lars von Trier to Michael Moore had the Sony, VX1000 and blah, blah. And it was super, it's an age thing, right? You guys remember. So, I mean, it was super exciting. And then you had the second kind of reinvention of video art. And, you had the big Bill Viola retrospective at Whitney and like the whole thing, right? So it was like this moment where it was very much, as I said, counterpoised to analog, specifically with photography, video, and sound. And also things like non-linear editing, which was like a trip, right, to have that access. I mean, this was amazing for artists. Obviously, we've shifted and we've lived through this shift. I feel where that kind of more media-based discussion has fallen to the side. And now digital obviously is much more bound up, at least for me, with internet and social media. Like it's very difficult for me to uncouple these terms. And I think for me, the most important thing, and it's tied to what I've always worked with, for me, the rise of the internet and the digital increasingly, I mean, not to be too much of a Luddite, but I think for me, it's really brought home the fact the way, a bit like COVID, it's exacerbated a great deal of existing inequalities in our society and global civil society. That is kind of what I'm super focused on. And that includes economic. We're in this obscene era of hyper-capitalism. And also, obviously, geographic inequalities. And I think that, and this is not to take away from all the benefits. Again, it's not that if you criticize technology, it's not either or. But the whole-scale privatization of what was a public research infrastructure and the way that public debate in civil society have been completely privatized. There is no public space that's digital, that's used by meaningfully large amounts of people. This is a travesty. So for me, I think, and even what we're saying now, right? It's being fed into some algorithm computer somewhere, and it's being used to make some computers smarter that will eventually replace artists. Or, I mean, I'm kind of being paranoid here, but, come on. We're also generating data. We're a bit like guinea pigs, even here. Even though it's very important as human beings, of course, we want to connect to each other, and especially in our field. So I think for me, this has always been, again, the exacerbation of inequality and the whole scale ongoing encroachment of the economic into the political and now even the social, the monetization of everyday life. It's relentless. So I think that is something that I have all super focused on, and less this kind of medium specific. So of course I work in diverse media, so I can do wood. I haven't tried oil yet, but you've kind of inspired me. You never know. But definitely wood, you know, frames, photos, video, whatever. So I'm moving between it, but again, it's more thematic, which is more around, as I said, things like inequality and power and access.
Can I just jump into, I think there was a great point with Maryam is the fact that part of what online art writing and journalism is also responding to is the way that things are being made has also changed. So when people talk about their studios now, for some young artists, that means their desktop, right? Like it literally just means the desktop and there's no actual physical space that they call a studio. That makes a lot more sense than why online media may be able to respond to those types of issues and interests that they have in a whole different type of way. Because it's also responding to the conditions of making and the types of things. So whether people are thinking about memes, you know, when they're making an artwork, even if they're making an oil painting, you know, being able to show a meme and to engage with it on the platform it originally emerged automatically makes it different. You know, in our case, our podcast, often when we're covering things like protests or different conversations, it adds a different texture and layer to the conversation that we can never capture in words and text. And this is where I think we're actually, in my opinion, we're evolving past an older model where text was the primary way that conversations were being done. Now YouTube videos are becoming very popular. I mean, it's been such a boom for, you know, video artists to be able to share things. I mean, I'm thinking, we were just talking about the 90s. I was thinking about how in the 90s, seeing video art was such a pain. I mean, I'm sure many of us had that experience. It was very difficult. It was hard to find. It was hard to access. Now, there's nothing that's hard to access in terms of video. And it's actually changed a whole different kind of ecosystem around the production of these. And it's also given us access to spaces where art traditionally did not function. You know, so that artists are being commissioned to make music videos and other things in a way with an ease that perhaps where it wasn't done before.
I agree with what Hrag's saying in terms of thinking about what digital can do that traditional writing or blog, as we were talking about before, what are the real virtues and potentialities? And it has a lot to do with this issue of voice, you know, really being able to carry voice in a different way, the way somebody sounds, the ability to listen to somebody, you know, speaking in your ear almost as if they're a friend, to drop in with someone through an Instagram live, to be able to see how someone looks and moves and lives. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing that's possible with new genres, and museums really need to explore these genres and can reconfigure their thinking in different ways in order to be able to do what digital can do well.
I memean, I will just say very quickly, a lot of artists, their studio is their laptop, but that's also because they're in these super, again, as an artist, I'm going to bring this up again, sorry, but you know, it's good, it's super expensive and it's not a choice but to go to the cafe and sit there. It's also like, it says a certain thing about places like New York, you know, and the changes that have happened there. So a lot of it's also, not that the laptop isn't an absolutely crucial tool, like my, you know, it's absolutely important for me, no doubt. But there's also an element of necessity in there.
Absolutely. And I'll just add to that also, it's also because the different ecosystems that are changing, like artist residencies have become much more, so like there are a number of young artists that go from residency to residency, right? So the necessity of being able to travel with your work and adapt while you're doing it is just, it's not even a nice to have, it's actually just the way it works now. Do you know, and I think even as a writer, I feel the same way. When I'm traveling, you know, I need to have my images with me. I need to be able to have my text. I need to be able to have that communication. So I think it's just the online digital field is just reflecting the realities of our lives.
And I guess it's also then about how more traditional art institutions like galleries and museums are able to relate to these more like ephemeral and spontaneous like artistic utterings, if you will. And one incident which was quite fascinating that you covered on Hyperallergic in your podcast series, Hrag, was this exhibition which was supposed to open at the Whitney, which was cancelled, which was about protest art. So maybe it's exactly that type of problematic that we're just talking about. Could you say a few more words on this particular case and how this might possibly relate to that problematic of institutional challenges, or maybe institutions that are not fit to respond to these kind of phenomena that we're facing here?
Well, I think that's an interesting example. Thank you for bringing that up, because I think that's an interesting example also of how institutions are just learning that the public has very strong opinions about what they do, and they're hearing it very quickly. I've had a number of conversations with people involved. One of the people that I think probably gave me some of the best insight is Tom Finkelpearl, who's the former Department of Culture, the commissioner here in New York, and was also the head of the Queen's Museum previously. And we had a conversation about this, and I think it's partly because museums and art institutions in the last 4 decades have really pushed the public to engage with art in new ways. And I think partly that's come out of this, and part of that means is they're pushing back and saying, you know what, that's not acceptable to us as a community. You need to respect a certain kind of conversations that's going on outside of the walls of the museum. So in the case of the Whitney, that was a case where the curator, who seemed very well intentioned and was predominantly an archivist and a librarian, had done a political art show based on ephemera that they had purchased from a number of fundraisers. The problem there was the fact that they didn't seem to understand that once it was being presented as like an exhibition rather than some sort of ephemera show, which automatically raised a lot of red flags for artists who are expected to be treated a certain way and to be given certain fees and to be approached differently when their work is entering a collection, right? And I think in that case, that was an example of an institution that was going a little too fast for what they should have done, which is sort of walked it back and said, you know what? Okay, maybe we should talk to these artists. This is a very sensitive time. People don't necessarily want to see their work that they're trying to raise money for a charity for on the walls of an institution, you know, and then present it as if they're doing good rather than actually engaging with the issue. So that was an example of like the community spoke back to the institution and said, you know what, this isn't acceptable for us. Do you know? And the institution, to their credit, listened. I'm sure it was very difficult because I think we're discovering that, you know, a lot of people's first reaction is just sort of to say no. Oh, they're just being irrational. You know, this is the first tendency for institutions, I think. And I think people, it's very human. But in that case, they were actually able to listen and be like, you know what, maybe we should rethink this. And I think this is what's happening more and more. And it's not something that often people who are specialized and spent 10 years of their lives studying a field have been taught to do. Do you know? The public's responses are not something that institutions are necessarily, especially specialists in institutions, are taught to do, you know, and is part of their training. And I have to say, as somebody who hires and commissions writing, I'm often forced, what I joke is deprogram art writers before they write, because they're sometimes brought with these very old notions of what art writing is. And you have to deprogram it and be like, you know what, where are you getting these preconceived ideas from? How do we change this? How do we engage? And I feel the same type of thing is happening in curatorial departments. I think the same thing is happening even with artists and the way they feel. Like I often tell artists, you know, you never demand enough from institutions. And I feel because artists often are too like, they're just thankful to be included. And you're like, no. You guys can demand more. And most of the time I push artists to demand more, they end up actually getting a better deal. And that's frankly, this is part of the conversation we have to have, right? And I think that's what is changing majorly. And I think the Whitney Museum example is a good example of like, people spoke back. Now the museum knows that this is not acceptable to the community and they're going to change it.
There's one thing I'd like to comment on about what Hrag is saying, which is about the temporality of this moment, the way that time passes. I mean, it's a weird moment. It's hard to tell whether, you know, time has gone in a flash or whether it's gone in, you know, been years since March. And there's also, I think, an institutional learning curve about, you know, how do you calibrate time in different media? You know, the time of social media, and when can you slow things down and have different conversations that you can really dig in and have some deep thought, and how can we learn, you know, collectively, the museum sector as a whole, how to make space for those conversations that need time, that have to be a sort of slow process, and how do we conduct those in public and figure out how platforms can work in that way. I think there's all kinds of weird time challenges in this moment. The time of conversation, the time of thought.
Yeah, I mean, that really resonates with me, and I really agree with that, because it's true. There's the artist time is much slower. It's thinking time is slower, but reaction time is very, very fast now. And museums, but also artists, they move a bit slower. I mean, obviously institutions, but also artists, and in terms of their processing. I also think one of the things, I mean, again, from an artistic perspective, that I think is happening increasingly is, you know, we're in this age, and super important for artists, where artists are no longer have the lock on content creation and production. And, you know, it used to be the mainstream media, and then the alternatives, and us, you know, that was it. Now it's everybody and anybody. And I think, and not just content creation, but content distribution. And I think that's a very, very interesting challenge that I kind of impress upon my students, and that I'm trying to understand that it's a radical, radical, radical shift. So a speeding up of time, I totally agree, and also a complete, our traditional monopoly almost on images and on content, or novels, whatever, it's just been imploded. I mean, not that you didn't always have home movies and blah, 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 but, you know, it's the intensity has just been amped up. And I think another super interesting thing, again, that artists need to wrestle with, and I certainly am, is also the incredible production of an overload of information, and the sheer volume and mass of it, as people who are supposed to be producing new things and putting them out there. I mean, there's almost a pollution. And, you know, there's been this discussion, which I think is super interesting, again, that censorship in the old days used to be about scarcity of information, and now it's about overproduction. It's like the George Orwell view versus the Aldous Huxley view. And I think for me, my approach in the digital era approach to information has really changed, and the way I use it. And by information, I also mean visual information. And for me, increasingly, it's as much about removing information. So there's a lot of verbs that are used in digital culture in terms of artists, you know, remixing, sampling, ripping, sharing, downloading, all. But I would almost add excising or removing. So it's almost become sculptural. It's like negative space there, and yet it's been removed. And I think that, so it's, I think for artists, it's less and less bringing, at least for me, hidden truths to light. You know, a kind of WikiLeaks model. Not that that isn't important, but increasingly about removing and trying to cut through the fog. Not, you know, and using actually even the physical space of the exhibition for that, because which is something I'm still wedded to. So I think for me, yeah, as I said, time, information, and lack of monopoly are kind of the three takeaways. I mean, just to put that out there.
I would pause on the word content itself. Which is a word that's in my title, but I hate it because it comes from a world of branding. And I think it actually ends up being an obstacle in understanding, having conversations across lines, especially in a museum. And one of the things that I was trying to think about in this new role that I have, or newish role, is you know, museums have always provided commentary. You know, they've provided commentary in different ways, but it took place within an institution that was deeply embedded in print culture. And content signals the idea that you're still offering commentary, but it can inhabit any medium. It could be a commentary, curatorial commentary on a film that's delivered, you know, as an audio score over a film expert, but that idea that commentary can travel and can inhabit other media, and it's actually not functionally different. The goal is still the same, but the technology and the mediums have changed, is I think something that's important, or has been important for me to try to articulate in the museum context, that content is the conversations that we have with our audiences. And, you know, to try to strip back the connotations of the branding idea.
And it's really a shame that I have to cut off the discussion here at this point, because this is unfortunately all the time that we had. But I would like to thank our participants so much for being with us today. Hrag, Leah, and Maryam, thanks so much. And of course, a big thank you to everybody watching and listening. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the rest of the book fair, and see you next time, and bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.